Now we are going to discuss neural tube defects. It is of two types. One is spina bifida occulta and the second is spina bifida aperta. What is occult? Occult means hidden. So spina bifida occulta is closed or hidden. See the differences. It is of two types. First is spina bifida occulta and the second is spina bifida aperta. Spina bifida aperta. Okay, occulta means it's hidden. That's why spina bifida occulta is also known as closed spina bifida. So in spina bifida occulta, since it is closed spina bifida, there is incomplete closure of one or more vertebral arches. But what happens? There is no herniation of meninges or spinal cord. So it is associated with incomplete closure of one or more vertebra without any herniation of meninges or spinal cord. Spina bifida aperta is further divided into meningocele, myelomeningocele and myeloschisis. And you must be knowing that in meningocele there is herniation of only meninges, whereas in myelomeningocele there is herniation of both meninges and spinal cord. So see what are the differences between spina bifida occulta, meningocele, myelomeningocele. Now see this picture. Here you can see that this is the dura, this is dura, this is the meninges, here there is spinal cord and this is subarachnoid space. Clear? So dura, meninges, you can see spinal cord and there is subarachnoid space. If you see the first diagram, this one and this one, it's normal spine. Clear? First one is normal. If you see the second one, here you can notice what? That there is tuft of hair. On the skin, sometimes there is presence of tuft of hair or sometimes there is dimpling. So what? There is presence of tuft of hair or sometimes there is dimpling. Clear? But what you can notice that there is no herniation of meninges or spinal cord. You can see that there is defect in posterior vertebral arch. Can you see? This part is posterior vertebral arch. Posterior vertebral arch. Okay. So here you can notice that there is defect in posterior vertebral arch without herniation of meninges or spinal cord, and on the skin you are going to notice that there is tuft of hair or dimpling. So this is what? This is occulta. So this is known as spina bifida occulta or closed spina bifida. If you see this one, meningocele, so what you can see here that there is defect. Along with the defect there is herniation of meninges. So if there is only herniation of meninges, spinal cord is not herniated. So this is meningocele. So here you can see this is the meninges and it is containing the clear fluid, that is CSF, without any herniation of spinal cord. So this is meningocele. And here you can see there is herniation of what? Meninges. Apart from that, there is herniation of spinal cord. So here you can notice there is defect, herniation of meninges and spinal cord. So this is myelomeningocele. Clear? One by one we are going to discuss. First we are going to discuss the meningocele. So here you can see that this is meningocele. Meningocele. So this is meningocele, means there is herniation of meninges through the defect in posterior vertebral arch. Okay. Now see, it is cystic sac and there is clear CSF. So there is presence of clear fluid, that is CSF. What is the good thing about meningocele? That here there is normal development of spinal cord. There is normal development of spinal cord, and second, there is normal position of spinal cord in the spinal canal. Okay. So what are the good things? First, that there is normal development. There is normal development of spinal cord, and second, there is normal position in the spinal canal. Now see the characteristic features of meningocele. Here you can see that there is fluctuant midline swelling. What's the location? It's midline. So it's fluctuant midline swelling covered with skin and it contains clear fluid, that's CSF. Because of that, it is brilliantly transilluminant. Very important point. Meningocele is brilliantly transilluminant. So what's the exact location? It is located along the vertebral column in the lower back. Clear? Covered by skin, it is brilliantly transilluminant. Now see how it looks like whenever we are going to perform the transillumination test. So here you can see how it looks like. So on performing the transillumination test, you can see it is brilliantly transilluminant. So how we can diagnose? Suppose we are going for X-ray. If we are going for X-ray, we can detect the vertebral defects. So vertebral defects can be detected on the X-ray. So on X-ray, you can see the vertebral defects. Okay. How we are going to manage the patients of meningocele? So in certain cases, immediate surgery is required, and in certain cases, even delayed surgery is sufficient. So in which cases we are going for immediate surgery, and in which cases we are going for delayed surgery? This question was asked 2 to 3 times in AIIMS. So if patient is having leaking CSF or there is thin skin covering, in these cases there is increased risk of infection. That's why immediate surgery is required. So what are the treatment options? Either we can go for immediate surgery or we can go for delayed surgery. Delayed surgery. So the patients who are having leaking CSF or the patients who are having thin skin covering. Patients are having thin skin covering. In both of these cases, there is increased risk of infection. That's why immediate surgery is required. And if patient is asymptomatic with normal neurological finding and there is full thickness skin covering. So if the patient is asymptomatic with normal neurological findings, clear, and there is full thickness skin covering, clear. So in these patients we can go for delayed surgery. So this is how we manage the patients of meningocele. Now coming to myelomeningocele. Myelomeningocele is the most severe form of dysraphism involving the vertebral column. First important statement, it's the most severe form. This is the most severe form of dysraphism involving vertebral column. Clear? And we discussed that in myelomeningocele there is herniation of both meninges and the spinal cord. Now coming to the incidence. The incidence of myelomeningocele is 1 in 4,000 live births. So how much is the incidence? It is in 1 in 4,000 live births. Okay. One question which is frequently asked, that is, what's the most common site of myelomeningocele? And you must be knowing it is the lumbosacral region. So the most common site of myelomeningocele is the lumbosacral region. So here you can see that there is vertebral defect here, and there is herniation of what? Meninges as well as spinal cord. Now see, this topic is asked in pharma, it is asked in pediatrics as well as in surgery. And the questions are mainly related to etiology. So in cases of myelomeningocele, there is genetic predisposition. Imagine if one child is affected, how much is the risk of reoccurrence? It is 3 to 4%. And if 2 children are having myelomeningocele, how much is the risk of occurrence? It is up to 10%. And you know that there is association of folic acid deficiency with neural tube defects, and especially which one? Myelomeningocele. So we are going to discuss the etiology. And for myelomeningocele, there is genetic predisposition. So for such patients, there is genetic predisposition. And in exam, they ask one percentage Okay, so the percentage is how much is the risk of occurrence if one child is affected. You have to remember it is 3 to 4%, and if two children are affected, it is up to 10%. These two percentages are asked, you have to remember. Clear? So in high risk cases, how we can decrease the incidence of neural tube defects? By periconceptional use of folic acid. So very important statement, this was asked many times. Periconceptional folic acid supplementation. Periconceptional folic acid supplementation. It can decrease the incidence of neural tube defects by 50% in high risk cases. In high risk cases. So see, periconceptional folic acid supplementation can decrease the incidence of neural tube defects by 50% in high risk cases. There are many drugs which are going to increase the risk of neural tube defects, but this list is dominated by anti-epileptics. So maternal use of anti-epileptics increases the risk of neural tube defects, especially myelomeningocele. So what are the agents which are going to increase the risk of neural tube defects? Have a look. Drugs increasing the risk of neural tube defects. So the drugs are phenytoin, carbamazepine, trimethoprim, sulfamethoxazole, phenobarbital, primidone and valproate. So here you can see the list is dominated by anti-epileptics. How to remember? The mnemonic is PCTPV. The mnemonic is PCTPV. P. Phenytoin. C. Carbamazepine. T. Trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole. P. Phenobarbital. P. Primidone and valproate. So what? Anti-epileptics, especially the maternal use, increases the risk of neural tube defects, and especially which one? Myelomeningocele. Now see the clinical features. Okay, so apart from dysfunction of central nervous system and peripheral nervous system, these patients are having dysfunction of skeleton, genitourinary tract and gastrointestinal tract. And see, the neurological dysfunction depends on the location of myelomeningocele. So neurological deficit mainly depends on the location, and second, it is dependent on the associated lesions. So see the clinical features. There is dysfunction of CNS and PNS, central nervous system and peripheral nervous system dysfunction. Apart from this, there is dysfunction of first skeleton or skeletal system, second GIT means gastrointestinal tract, and third genitourinary tract. So this is GUT. Now see here the neurological deficit in these patients. Why? Because there is herniation of spinal cord also. Neurological deficit in these patients is dependent first on the site of myelomeningocele. So what's the location? And second, the associated lesions. Okay, so how we can prevent? We can prevent the neural tube defect, especially this myelomeningocele, by folic acid supplementation. So how much folic acid should be given? It is 0.4 mg OD. So it is 0.4 milligram per day. So 0.4 mg OD. In which patients? In all females who are of childbearing age. In all females who are of childbearing age or who are about to become pregnant. So what? About to become pregnant. Clear? So what is the question which is asked? They ask this dose. How much? It is the 0.4 mg OD. So this is how we can prevent the neural tube defects. Arnold-Chiari malformation is divided into two types. Type 1 Chiari malformation and type 2 Chiari malformation. One by one we are going to discuss. First we are going to discuss type 1. Type 1 Chiari malformation. And how to remember this type 1 Chiari malformation? See what happens here. T goes into C. So there is herniation of T into C. T means herniation of tonsil. C means cervical canal. So here there is herniation of cerebellar tonsil into cervical canal. So what? Type 1 Chiari malformation. T means tonsil goes into C, that is cervical canal. Second, in C there is syringomyelia. Means in the cervical canal there is syringomyelia also. So in this diagram you can notice, can you see here that there is herniated cerebellar tonsil, and where this is cervical canal. So herniated cerebellar tonsil into cervical canal. Simultaneously you can notice that there is syringomyelia of cervical canal. In type 1 Chiari malformation, hydrocephalus is absent, and generally these children are asymptomatic, right? But in adolescence or in adulthood, symptoms are going to appear. Okay, so important points. First, there is herniated cerebellar tonsil into cervical canal. Second, there is syringomyelia of cervical canal. And third, important point, that hydrocephalus is absent. It is not associated with hydrocephalus. Clear? So we discussed there are no symptoms during childhood, no symptoms during childhood, and patients are going to notice the symptom during adolescence or adulthood. What kind of symptoms are seen? Have a look. See the clinical features. So these patients can have recurrent headache, there is neck pain, there is increased urinary frequency, and certain patients are having progressive lower extremity spasticity. So this is the group of symptoms which is seen in type 1 Chiari malformation. Now have a look of type 2 Chiari malformation. Now see the problem in type 2 Chiari malformation, that it is a hindbrain anomaly. What kind of anomaly? It is hindbrain anomaly. Okay, and we discussed that in type 1 Chiari malformation there is no hydrocephalus, but in this case you will notice that there is hydrocephalus. Clear? So because of increased intracranial pressure, inferior vermis, pons and medulla, all these are forced or pushed through the cervical canal. Second association, apart from hydrocephalus, it is also associated with meningomyelocele. So important problems, it's hindbrain anomaly, it is associated with hydrocephalus, and it is associated with myelomeningocele. Now see what are the characteristic features of type 2 Chiari malformation. It is characterized by elongation of fourth ventricle, there is kinking of brainstem because of increased intracranial pressure, and there is displacement of inferior vermis, pons, medulla into cervical canal. Why? Because of increased intracranial pressure. Why? Because it is associated with hydrocephalus. So these are the characteristic features of type 1 and type 2 Chiari malformations. Okay, now see what are the investigations which are done and how we are going to manage the Chiari malformation. So first, the investigations. If we perform X-ray, there is small posterior fossa with widened cervical canal. So what's the finding? On X-ray, there is small posterior fossa, with widened cervical canal. Widened cervical canal. Okay, and what are the findings which are seen on MRI? So we discussed that in Chiari 1 malformation, there is herniation of cerebellar tonsil into cervical canal, so that can be visualized. In type 2, there is hindbrain anomaly, so that can be seen on MRI. So here we can see cerebellar tonsil protruding into cervical canal. Protruding into cervical canal. Clear? And we can detect the hindbrain anomalies. Hindbrain anomalies. Clear? Now, how we are going to manage Chiari malformations? So we have to perform the surgical decompression. So management. In Arnold Chiari malformation, we go for surgical decompression. And this Chiari malformation is frequently asked both in surgery as well as in pediatrics. Now see, what is the name of this condition? This is Dandy-Walker malformation. And what is this Dandy-Walker malformation? This is the most common posterior fossa malformation. What's the problem in this case? There is developmental failure. What's the problem? There is developmental failure of roof of fourth ventricle. And because of this developmental failure of roof of fourth ventricle, what happens? There is enlarged fourth ventricle. And second, you can see that there is cyst formation in posterior fossa. So there is cystic expansion of this fourth ventricle into the posterior fossa. This is one problem. Second, you can see that there is abnormally formed cerebellum. So what is the problem? So there is midline cerebellar hypoplasia. What's the problem in cerebellum? There is midline cerebellar hypoplasia. Okay. Other problems here you can see that there is agenesis of corpus callosum also. Sometimes if it's present, it's abnormal. So there can be abnormal or absent corpus callosum. Clear? Now see the problem here. There is enlarged fourth ventricle, cystic expansion of posterior fossa. These patients have hydrocephalus. So there is increased intracranial tension, and because of this increased intracranial tension, these patients have macrocephaly. Because of increased intracranial tension, you can see that the brainstem can be compressed. Okay, so one by one we are going to discuss the important points related to Dandy-Walker malformation. First question, that it's the most common posterior fossa malformation. Okay, and it's characterized by developmental failure. It is characterized by developmental failure of roof of fourth ventricle. Developmental failure of roof of fourth ventricle. And because of that, what happens? Because of that, there is cystic expansion of fourth ventricle. Cystic expansion of fourth ventricle, and here you can see where is that expansion. So it's into posterior fossa. Can you see here? So into posterior fossa. And second problem, that there is midline cerebellar hypoplasia. So it is characterized by midline cerebellar hypoplasia. Hypoplasia. Clear? Now see, sometimes they are asking the characteristic triad of Dandy-Walker's malformation. So what's the characteristic triad? Characteristic triad of Dandy-Walker malformation. So the components are hypoplasia of vermis, there is cephalad rotation of vermian remnant, and cystic dilatation of fourth ventricle, and we discussed it is extending posteriorly or extending into posterior fossa. There is enlarged posterior fossa with torcular lambdoid inversion. So these are the components of triad of Dandy-Walker's malformation. Now see the clinical features. Okay. So what is the main problem? There is developmental failure of the roof of the fourth ventricle. So these patients have hydrocephalus. Main problem, these patients have hydrocephalus, and because of this hydrocephalus, patient is going to develop what? Macrocephaly. There is macrocephaly. Okay. So what is the question which is asked related to macrocephaly? That what is the most common manifestation of Dandy-Walker's malformation? And it's the macrocephaly. First question, most common manifestation of Dandy-Walker's malformation, and that is macrocephaly. Because of hydrocephalus, what happens? There is rapid increase in the head size and there is prominent occiput. So second problem, rapid increase in head size. There is rapid increase in head size. Clear? And these patients have prominent occiput. There is involvement of posterior fossa. So since there is involvement of posterior fossa, these patients are having ataxia. And what? There is evidence of long tract signs. Another problem, these patients have evidence of long tract signs, and there is cerebellar ataxia. Why there is cerebellar ataxia? Because there is hypoplasia of cerebellum, there is involvement of posterior fossa. These patients have structural abnormalities, and because of the structural abnormalities, these patients have delayed cognitive or motor milestones. So another problem, these patients have delayed cognitive or motor milestones. Why? Because of structural abnormalities. Clear? In how many cases there is CNS abnormalities? In patients of Dandy-Walker's malformation, 70% patients have CNS abnormalities. So see, it is associated with CNS abnormalities. In how many patients? In 70% cases. And what are the CNS abnormalities which are seen? So we discussed that these patients have agenesis of posterior cerebellar vermis and corpus callosum. Simultaneously, certain patients have cortical dysplasia. They can be polymicrogyria. So these are the CNS abnormalities which are seen in patients of Dandy-Walker's malformation. Now, what is the investigation of choice for diagnosis? So obviously it is MRI. And how we are going to treat the patient? Main problem of the patient is what? Hydrocephalus, increased intracranial tension. So we have to shunt the cystic cavity. So for diagnosis, important point, that what is the investigation of choice for diagnosis? And this is what? MRI. So this is MRI. Clear? And how we are going to treat, since the patients are having hydrocephalus, so we have to perform shunting of cystic cavity. So in treatment, shunting of cystic cavity is done. So this is how we manage the patients of Dandy-Walker's malformation. Now we are going to discuss cerebrovascular accidents. So first, see what are the causes of cerebrovascular accidents. Ischemic causes are responsible for 85% cases, and hemorrhagic causes are responsible for 15% cases. Okay, so see what are the causes of cerebrovascular accident. First, ischemic causes. Clear? And the second is hemorrhagic causes. Ischemic and hemorrhagic. Clear? Ischemic causes, these are responsible for 85% cases of cerebrovascular accidents, and hemorrhagic causes, these are responsible for 15% cases, right? In ischemic causes, so out of ischemic causes, for 75% cases, embolic occlusion is responsible, and for 25% cases, thrombotic causes. So here, in ischemic causes, there is embolic occlusion, which is responsible for 75% of cases of ischemic causes, and the second is thrombotic causes. Clear? And thrombotic is responsible for 25% of cases. In hemorrhagic causes, out of 15%, for 10% cases, parenchymal or intracerebral hemorrhage, this is responsible. For 1 to 2%, it is subarachnoid hemorrhage, and for less than 1% cases, each EDH means extradural hematoma and SDH, that is subdural hematoma, that's responsible. One by one we are going to discuss. First we are going to discuss intracerebral hemorrhage, also known as parenchymal hemorrhage. Intracerebral hemorrhage, also known as parenchymal hemorrhage, it's the most common type of intracranial hemorrhage. And what is the most common cause? You must be knowing that it is hypertension. Because of hypertension, there is rupture of small arteries and arterioles. So where is the hemorrhage? The most common site is basal ganglia. And in basal ganglia, what's the most common site? Putamen. All these are frequently asked questions. Have a look one by one. First, that intracerebral or parenchymal hemorrhage is the most common type of intracranial hemorrhage. Okay, what is the most common cause? The most common cause is hypertension, right? And because of this hypertension, what's the problem? There is rupture of small perforating arteries. So it leads to rupture of small perforating arteries. Perforating arteries and arterioles. Clear? What is the most common site? It's basal ganglia, and in basal ganglia it's the putamen. Another important question. So the most common site is the basal ganglia, and in basal ganglia, so overall most common site is putamen. These are frequently asked questions related to intracerebral hemorrhage. Now see, most common type of intracranial hemorrhage is intracerebral hemorrhage. What is the second most common type of intracranial hemorrhage? And it is subarachnoid hemorrhage. So see, subarachnoid hemorrhage. Okay, important points. It's the second most common type of intracranial hemorrhage. Now see, what is the cause? What is the most common cause of subarachnoid hemorrhage? You must be knowing. It is trauma. And what is the second most common cause? It is the rupture of Berry aneurysm. Related to aneurysm, two questions are there. First, what's the most common site of intracranial aneurysm? And it's the anterior circulation. And what's the most common type? It is Berry aneurysm. So Berry aneurysm is most commonly located in circle of Willis. In which circulation? Anterior circulation. And the second question, most common type of extracranial aneurysm, and we discussed that is infrarenal aorta. Okay, so see, important points. What's the most common cause of subarachnoid hemorrhage? This is trauma followed by rupture of Berry aneurysm. Rupture of Berry. So it's rupture of Berry aneurysm. Okay, and you know the most common site of Berry aneurysm is anterior circulation of circle of Willis. So in detail we are going to discuss what Berry aneurysm. This is very important. It is asked in medicine, asked in surgery, asked in pathology. Berry aneurysm. So first important question, Berry aneurysm is the most common type of intracranial aneurysm. It is saccular, and generally what is the site of origin? Generally it is going to arise at the site of bifurcation of intracranial arteries. So three important points related to Berry aneurysm. First, it's the most common type of intracranial aneurysm. It's the most common type of intracranial aneurysm. Okay, what's the shape or appearance? It is saccular. This is saccular, and generally it is going to arise from bifurcation. You have to remember this word, bifurcation of intracranial arteries. And we discussed 85% aneurysms are located in the anterior circulation. Now see the distribution. There is some controversy related to exact percentage. So the most accepted percentage we are going to discuss with you. Now see the most common site of Berry aneurysm. It is seen in anterior circulation. See, this is anterior cerebral artery. So this is anterior cerebral artery, and here you can see this is anterior communicating artery. Can you see? So there is junction of anterior cerebral artery and anterior communicating artery. This is responsible for 40% cases. So overall, which one is the most common site? The most common site is the junction of anterior communicating artery and anterior cerebral artery junction. Now see, this is middle cerebral artery. What's the name? This is middle cerebral artery, and you can see this is the bifurcation of middle cerebral artery, responsible for 34% of cases. So what is the second most common site? It's the middle cerebral artery bifurcation. Second most common. Now you can see what's the name of this artery. This is internal carotid artery. Clear? So you can see this is internal carotid artery and this is posterior communicating artery. So if you see the junction of internal carotid artery and posterior communicating artery, it's responsible for 20% cases. So this is third most common site. You can see here this is internal carotid artery. So there is intracranial bifurcation. Clear? So this is fourth site. And can you see this is the fifth site. And what is this? This is the vertebrobasilar or basilar artery bifurcation. So we are going to quickly revise. Most common is the junction of anterior communicating artery with anterior cerebral artery. Second most common site is the bifurcation of middle cerebral artery. Third is the junction of internal carotid artery and posterior communicating artery. Fourth, intracranial carotid bifurcation, and the fifth is vertebrobasilar or basilar artery bifurcation. The list of risk factors for Berry aneurysm is very long, but two most important risk factors are smoking and aneurysm. So what are the risk factors? Two most important risk factors, and that's what smoking and aneurysm. If you remember, there was question related to Berry aneurysm in pathology. It was asked both in AIIMS and in NEET. And the question was, what is the structural abnormality in Berry aneurysm? Very, very important point. So see, what's the structural abnormality? Structural abnormality in Berry aneurysm. So in Berry aneurysm, there is absence of smooth muscle and intimal elastic lamina. You have to remember there is absence of smooth muscle, clear, and intimal elastic lamina. Clear? When the question is asked, they give one of the option. Either the smooth muscle is mentioned in the option or intimal elastic lamina is mentioned. So there is absence. This is the catchy word. Absence of smooth muscle and intimal elastic lamina. Second important point, the wall of aneurysm is made of thickened hyalinized intima. So here what's the problem? If you see the wall of aneurysm is made of thickened. It is made of thickened hyalinized intima. Clear? So these are the important questions which are asked in pathology. Now there are certain conditions which are associated with increased risk of Berry aneurysm. List is very, very important. You have to remember. So see, conditions associated with Berry aneurysm. Berry aneurysm. So what are the conditions? First, fibromuscular dysplasia, Marfan syndrome, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, coarctation of aorta, autosomal dominant polycystic kidney disease, and NF1, that is neurofibromatosis 1. This list is very, very important. How to remember? One question, who can modify the budget? So budget can be modified by finance minister. So finance minister easily can. Who can modify the budget? Finance minister easily can. Clear? So this is the list and it's very, very easy to remember because mnemonic is there. Now see, there are two presentations of Berry aneurysm. One, it is diagnosed incidentally on radiological investigation and the patient is completely asymptomatic. So if it is unruptured, what? Patient is completely asymptomatic and it is detected incidentally. If there is rupture of Berry aneurysm, we discussed that it can lead to intracerebral hemorrhage, it can cause subarachnoid hemorrhage, or it can lead to both. So presentation, it can be unruptured and the second situation, it is ruptured. Okay, unruptured berry aneurysm, it's generally completely asymptomatic. Okay, and ruptured berry aneurysm, it can lead to intracerebral hemorrhage, it can lead to subarachnoid hemorrhage, or it can lead to both. Now see, this is the aneurysm. Okay, another question is asked that what is the most common site of rupture, and if you see, this is the dome or apex. What is this? This is dome or apex of aneurysm. So generally the rupture occurs from the dome or apex. So dome or apex is the most common site of rupture. Okay, now coming to the management, we have two options. One is endovascular coil occlusion, and second is we perform craniotomy and go for surgical clipping. So which one is preferred is the endovascular coil occlusion, which is preferred. If endovascular coil occlusion is not possible, in those cases only we go for craniotomy and perform the surgical clipping of aneurysm. So see the management, endovascular coil occlusion. So endovascular coil occlusion, it is preferred over surgical clipping. Simple. And if this endovascular coil occlusion, if it's not possible, in those cases we perform craniotomy. So we go for craniotomy followed by surgical clipping, right? So this is how we manage the patients of berry aneurysm. Now we are going to discuss brain abscess. So see, what's the cause of brain abscess? Generally you see either there is direct spread or there is hematogenous spread. Imagine during surgery we are performing the surgery of some infected air sinuses, and from these infected air sinuses the infection reaches brain. So this is direct spread. And what is hematogenous spread? Via blood vessels the infection reaches brain. Generally it occurs in the patients who are having respiratory infection, patients who are having endocarditis, or patients who are having dental infections. So for brain abscess there are two routes, either there is direct spread or there is hematogenous spread. Okay, two routes, either there is direct spread or there is hematogenous spread. Direct spread, it occurs during surgery, especially from air sinus infection. From air sinus infection there is direct spread to the brain. And hematogenous spread means via blood vessels. What's the color of blood? Red. So the mnemonic is also red. Very easy to remember. R means patients who are having respiratory infection. E, endocarditis. D, dental infections. So respiratory infections, endocarditis, and dental infections. Clear? We read in pediatrics that the patients, especially the children who are having cyanotic heart disease, there is increased risk of brain abscess. And the patients whose immunity is down, even those patients are having increased risk of brain abscess. So which patient? Immunocompromised patients. So these are the two groups of patients who are at increased risk for developing brain abscess. So there is increased risk of brain abscess in two categories. First, cyanotic heart disease, and second, immunocompromised patients like HIV positive patients. Now see, the most common site of brain abscess, it depends on the etiology. Imagine the patient who is having ear infection or the patients who are having mastoiditis. In these patients, what is the most common site is the temporal lobe followed by cerebellum. Second, the patients who are having dental infections or air sinuses infection, especially the paranasal sinuses infection. So from this area, the infection reaches to the frontal lobe, and the patients who are having hematogenous spread, in those patients, what is the most common site is the parietal lobe. So one by one, see, suppose this patient is having ear infection, or patient is having what? Mastoiditis. So from this, what is the most common site? Is the temporal lobe followed by cerebellum. So from first important point, if the patient is having ear infection, that's otitis media. Okay, or patient is having mastoiditis. In these cases, the most common site is temporal lobe followed by cerebellum. Okay, temporal lobe followed by cerebellum. If the patient is having dental infection or paranasal sinusitis, so here, so from this area, infection reaches to the frontal lobe. So frontal lobe is the most common site in which patients having dental infections or patients having paranasal sinusitis. Paranasal sinusitis, right? And in which cases the most common site is parietal lobe, the patients who are having hematogenous spread. Okay, so we are going to revise it quickly. It's very important. Most common site in the patients who are having otitis media or mastoiditis, temporal lobe followed by cerebellum. If there is dental infection or paranasal sinusitis, most common site is frontal lobe. And if there is hematogenous spread, the most common site is parietal lobe. Patient is having brain abscess in the brain. Now see the manifestations. There is pus collection. So what? This patient will be having fever. Second, see, there is pus collection in the brain. So there is space occupying lesion. Because of this space occupying lesion, what happens? There is increased intracranial tension. And because of this increased intracranial tension, some of the patients are going to develop seizures, and it can lead to focal neurological deficit. So see, what are the clinical features? Easy to remember. So there is brain abscess. So patient is having fever. Where is abscess in the brain? So there is space occupying lesion. Because of space occupying lesion, so there is increased intracranial tension. These patients have increased risk of seizures and focal neurological deficit. Right? Now coming to the investigation. You know that investigation of choice for diagnosis of brain abscess is MRI. If you go for CT, there is presence of ring enhancing lesions. So see the diagnosis. Important question. What's the investigation of choice for diagnosis? It's MRI. Right? And if you perform CT, there is ring enhancing lesions. Ring enhancing lesions. Here you can see the CT of a patient who is having brain abscess. Can you see? There is ring enhancing lesion. So this is CT showing ring enhancing lesion. Clear? In brain abscess. So how we are going to manage the brain abscess? Simple. We have to drain it and we have to give antibiotics. What kind of? IV antibiotics, and it's given for 6 weeks. Second situation, some patients are having multiple abscess. So if the patient is having multiple small abscesses, in these cases we just give antibiotics. So how we are going to manage? Management of brain abscess. So we perform surgical drainage and we give IV antibiotics. So surgical drainage plus IV antibiotics. Duration generally for 6 weeks. Second situation, if the patient is having multiple small abscesses, for that IV antibiotics only. So only IV antibiotics if patient is having multiple small abscesses. Okay, sometimes because of abscess there is edema or there is mass effect. So in such patients we have to give steroids. So in which cases steroids are given? Steroids. The patients who are having edema or there is mass effect. And we discussed in clinical features that there is increased risk of seizures. So the patients who are at increased risk to develop seizures, what we have to give? Anti-epileptics. So we give anti-epileptics. Why? Because there is increased risk of seizures. So this is how we manage the patients of brain abscess. Now we are going to discuss brain herniation syndrome. Okay, so what is the cause of brain herniation? See, there is increased intracranial tension. So what are the causes which are responsible for raised intracranial tension? So here you can see that it can be because of brain tumor, it can be because of head injury, brain tumor, head injury, or stroke. Clear? So because of all these things, there is increased intracranial tension, and increased intracranial tension is a risk factor for brain herniation. In this case, can you see there is head injury and leading to subdural hematoma, and because of that there is raised intracranial tension. So you can notice that what there is uncal or transtentorial herniation. Here you can see that this is tentorium cerebelli. This is tentorium cerebelli. Clear? So because of raised intracranial tension, uncus and temporal lobe are forced through tentorium cerebelli. But before discussing this brain herniation syndrome, let me discuss the important points related to anatomy. So you should remember the important landmarks. One is falx cerebri. So can you see? This is falx cerebri. Here you can see this area. Clear? And second important landmark is this tentorium cerebelli. I will be discussing these two. So falx cerebri and tentorium cerebelli. So one by one we are going to discuss. First we are going to discuss the uncal herniation, also known as transtentorial herniation. So in this case you can see that this is the uncal or transtentorial herniation. So in this case, what's the problem? Uncus and temporal lobe, these are forced through tentorium cerebelli. These are forced through tentorium cerebelli. Clear? And that's why, what's the name? This is known as uncal, also known as transtentorial herniation. Uncal or transtentorial herniation. Okay. So what happens in uncal or transtentorial herniation? That there is sequential compression of ipsilateral third nerve followed by brainstem followed by whole brainstem. So what is the problem here? There is sequential compression of ipsilateral third nerve, okay, followed by brainstem and followed by whole brainstem. Whole brainstem. Clear? So what are the signs associated with uncal or transtentorial herniation? It is divided into three categories. So there are early signs, there are late signs, and there are very late signs. Early signs, there are late signs, and very late signs. See, there is compression of third nerve. So here, ipsilateral dilated pupil is an early sign. So what's the early sign here? There is ipsilateral dilated pupil. Late signs include ipsilateral hemiplegia, there is progressive ptosis, and there is third nerve palsy. Apart from these, the patients are prone to develop Cheney-Stokes respiration. So these are late signs. Quadriparesis, bilateral dilated and fixed pupil, erratic respiration. These are very late signs, and it can lead to death also. So death can occur in these patients. So these are the signs associated with uncal or transtentorial herniation. Now there are two questions which are frequently asked in relation to uncal or transtentorial herniation. One is Kernohan's notch phenomena, and the second is Kernohan-Voltman sign. Okay, first see what is Kernohan's notch phenomena. So here you can see there is Kernohan's notch. What is this Kernohan's notch? This is a free edge of tentorium cerebelli. So what is this? This is free edge of tentorium. Okay, so one by one we are going to discuss. First we are going to discuss the Kernohan's notch phenomena. Now how to remember? It's very easy to remember. See, Kernohan's notch phenomena. Okay, so one thing is clear, that this Kernohan's notch phenomena is associated with which kind of herniation? Uncal or transtentorial herniation. And what happens in this, how to remember? The mnemonic is CPI, third Hind precedent. So CPI means there is cerebral peduncle indentation leading to ipsilateral third nerve palsy and ipsilateral hemiparesis. I'm repeating, CPI, third Hind precedent. So C means there is cerebral, what happens here? There is cerebral peduncle indentation. Cerebral peduncle indentation. What kind of ipsilateral or contralateral? So it's the contralateral. So there is contralateral cerebral peduncle indentation, and it leads to ipsilateral third nerve paralysis and ipsilateral hemiparesis. Clear? So there is ipsilateral third nerve paralysis, and what else? There is ipsilateral hemiparesis. Now you will not forget. Okay, so in uncal or transtentorial herniation, what happens? There is indentation of contralateral cerebral peduncle against the free edge of tentorium, and that's known as Kernohan's notch, and it leads to ipsilateral third nerve paralysis and ipsilateral hemiparesis. Clear? So this is known as Kernohan's notch phenomena. So what's the problem? There is contralateral cerebral peduncle indentation against the free edge of tentorium, which is known as Kernohan's notch, and this leads to ipsilateral third nerve paralysis, and there is ipsilateral hemiparesis. Okay, so easiest way to remember is CPI, third Hind precedent, cerebral peduncle indentation leads to ipsilateral third nerve paralysis and ipsilateral hemiparesis. Now see what is Kernohan's Voltman sign. In this case there is positive Babinski sign, and there is hemiparesis contralateral to original hemiparesis. So what's the problem here? Kernohan's Voltman sign. Okay, so in this case what's the problem? There is lateral displacement of midbrain. So because of this lateral displacement, there is lateral displacement of midbrain. Clear? And because of this lateral displacement of midbrain, there is compression of opposite cerebral peduncle. So what happens? There is compression of opposite cerebral peduncle, right? And because of this compression, there is positive Babinski sign. So in these patients, you have to remember that there is positive Babinski sign, and there is hemiparesis, and this hemiparesis is contralateral to original hemiparesis. So there is hemiparesis on opposite side, means contralateral to original hemiparesis. Clear? So this is Kernohan's Voltman sign. Both of these are frequently asked questions, both in AIIMS as well as in NEET. Now see the second type. This is central or tentorial herniation. So in this case, what's the problem? Diencephalon means thalamus and related structures. These are forced through tentorium. So this is known as central or tentorial herniation. Central or tentorial herniation. Right? So what happens in central or tentorial herniation? In this case, diencephalon means thalamus and related structures. These are forced through tentorium. So when diencephalon is forced through the tentorium, there is sequential compression of upper midbrain followed by pons followed by medulla. So what's the problem or what's the effect? There is sequential compression of upper midbrain, okay, followed by pons and followed by medulla. So here also we are going to discuss the signs in three categories: early signs, late signs and very late signs. See the list. Early signs, late signs and very late signs. Erratic respiration, small reactive pupil, increased tone of limbs and bilateral extensor plantar. All these are included in early signs. Now see the late signs. Cheney-Stokes respiration and decorticate rigidity. These are the late signs. And what are the very late signs? Here the patients are going to develop fixed and dilated pupil. Fixed and dilated pupils. Clear? Decorticate rigidity. Here you can see the decorticate rigidity. This is a late sign, but decerebrate rigidity, it's a very late sign. So see here there is decerebrate rigidity. So there is decerebrate rigidity. Clear? So these are the signs associated with central, also known as tentorial herniation. Now see in this diagram, this is free edge of falx cerebri. So what is this? This is free edge of falx cerebri. So whenever there is herniation of cingulate gyrus beneath free edge of falx cerebri, this is known as subfalcine herniation, also known as cingulate herniation. Okay, so what's the name? This is known as subfalcine, also known as cingulate herniation. Okay, so in this case we discussed that what's the problem here? There is displacement of cingulate gyrus beneath the free edge of falx cerebri. Displacement of cingulate gyrus beneath the free edge of falx cerebri. So what are the signs associated with subfalcine or cingulate herniation? So in these patients there is loss of consciousness and it can progress to coma. There is contralateral weakness and there is loss of brainstem reflexes. So these are the signs which are seen in subfalcine herniation. In certain conditions you can see that there is displacement of cerebellar tonsil via foramen magnum. So if there is displacement of cerebellar tonsil via foramen magnum, this is known as tonsillar herniation, also known as downward cerebellar herniation. So what's the name of this condition or herniation? This is cerebellar, downward cerebellar herniation, also known as tonsillar herniation. So downward cerebellar herniation. Clear? Now what is the problem in this case? So the patients who are having tonsillar or downward cerebellar herniation, there is coma and bilateral posturing. So coma, there is bilateral posturing. Clear? There is another one-liner question which is frequently asked in AIIMS as well as in NEET PG, and that is Durette hemorrhage. Again, it is related to herniation and raised intracranial tension. Okay, so what is the problem in durate hemorrhage? There is increased intracranial tension. Because of this increased intracranial tension, there is downward displacement of brainstem, and because of that, there is stretching of perforators. Because of this stretching of perforators of basilar artery, there is bleeding. And what is the site of bleeding? It occurs in ventral and paramedian areas of upper brainstem. So see what happens here. In these patients, there is raised intracranial tension. Because of this raised intracranial tension, there is downward displacement. Okay, so there is downward displacement of brainstem, and because of this downward displacement of brainstem, there is stretching of perforators of basilar artery. So stretching of perforators of basilar artery. Clear? And because of this, what happens? There is bleeding. This leads to bleeding. And what is the question they are going to ask? That what is the most common site of bleeding? So there is bleeding. What's the most common site? So generally there are small areas of bleeding. Where exactly? In the ventral and paramedian part. So the most common site is ventral and paramedian part of upper brainstem. Clear? And which include midbrain and pons. Upper brainstem, which includes midbrain and pons. Clear? So these are the one-liner questions which are frequently asked. The question which is asked here, that what is the most common site, is the ventral and paramedian part of upper brainstem, and generally it is caused by stretching of perforators of basilar artery in which patients who are having increased intracranial tension, which leads to downward displacement of brainstem. So this is all about cerebrovascular diseases.